There was a time when unfinished endings consumed you, a message left unanswered, a relationship that ended without explanation, a conversation that never reached resolution. Your mind replayed it. What did they mean? What really happened? Was it something I did? You searched for clarity, not casually, compulsively, because ambiguity felt intolerable. Carl Jung understood that the ego craves narrative symmetry. The ego wants clean endings. It wants cause and effect. It wants psychological order. When something ends without explanation, the ego experiences a rupture, an incomplete pattern. And incomplete patterns create tension. That tension feels like anxiety. Earlier, that anxiety demanded action. You reached out for clarification. You analyzed past conversations. You imagined alternate endings. You constructed theories. Because explanation felt like relief. Closure felt like control. If you understood why it ended, you could stabilize your identity again. But something has shifted now. A message goes unanswered, and you notice it, but you don't spiral. A relationship ends without full clarity, and you feel sadness but not obsession. An interaction fades into silence, and instead of chasing explanation, you let it remain unfinished. And part of you wonders, why doesn't this disturb me like it used to? It's not because you stopped caring. It's because you stopped depending on explanation to feel whole. Jung believed that much of closure seeking is an attempt by the ego to restore order when identity feels threatened. When someone leaves without explanation, the ego asks, "What does this mean about me?" Earlier, that question felt urgent. Did I fail? Was I not enough? Did I misread everything? You weren't just seeking facts. You were seeking reassurance. Reassurance that your identity was intact. But now, identity feels less negotiable. If someone exits without clarity, you do not immediately internalize it. You no longer assume their silence is a verdict on your worth. You allow the gap to exist. That tolerance of ambiguity signals psychological consolidation. Jung emphasized that individuation requires tolerating paradox and incompleteness. Not everything resolves neatly. Not every relationship provides explanation. Not every ending offers narrative closure. The ego wants symmetry. The self tolerates asymmetry. Earlier, silence felt like rejection. Now, silence feels like information. Information that something ended without requiring a story. You may still feel emotion, disappointment, curiosity, loss, but you do not feel compulsion. You do not feel the need to extract meaning immediately. That compulsion reduction is maturity. Earlier, you may have equated lack of closure with lack of respect. Now, you recognize something deeper. Not everyone has the capacity to explain themselves. Not everyone has the awareness to articulate endings. Not everyone leaves cleanly. And that does not always require your intervention. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Earlier, unfinished endings may have shaped your self-concept. Now they inform you, but do not define you. There's also a nervous system shift here. Earlier, ambiguity activated rumination. Your mind searched relentlessly for resolution. Now, rumination decreases. The thought appears, but it does not loop endlessly. Because identity no longer feels destabilized by unanswered questions. You may still reflect, but you do not obsess. There is a difference. Reflection seeks understanding. Obsession seeks control. Earlier, closure was about control. Now, acceptance replaces control. Acceptance does not mean agreement. It does not mean approval. It means allowing something to remain unfinished without collapsing internally. That ability marks ego strength. Fragile identity demands explanation. Stable identity tolerates silence. You may notice that you do not chase people for clarity anymore. You do not draft long messages demanding resolution. You do not rehearse what you would say if they responded. You simply let the absence stand. That shift can feel almost strange. You might ask, shouldn't I care more? But caring does not require chasing. Caring does not require forcing explanation. Caring can coexist with acceptance. Jung believed that the psyche moves toward wholeness not through perfect resolution, but through integration. Integration means this: an ending can remain incomplete, and you remain intact. Earlier, unfinished business felt like fragmentation. Now it feels like reality. Not every story concludes with dialogue. Not every question receives an answer. Not every silence is meant to be broken. And you no longer require symmetry to feel stable. You can let something end mid-sentence and continue your life without finishing it artificially. That is not detachment. It is integration. You are not suppressing the desire for clarity. You are no longer dependent on it. And that subtle shift changes how endings feel. They feel less like threats and more like transitions, even when they are quiet, even when they are unresolved, even when they are unfinished. When you look back honestly, you realize something uncomfortable. You weren't just seeking answers. You were seeking relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from rejection. Relief from the discomfort of not knowing. Carl Jung understood that the ego is deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. It prefers a painful certainty over an undefined absence. Even a harsh explanation can feel better than silence, because explanation restores structure. Earlier, when something ended without clarity, your mind worked over time. You reconstructed timelines. You analyzed tone. You searched for hidden meanings, not because you love drama, but because ambiguity felt like a threat to identity. If you didn't know why it ended, your mind filled in the blanks, and those blanks often turned inward. What did I do wrong? What did I miss? Was I not enough? Closure-seeking was often an attempt to repair self-image. Jung described how the ego forms narratives to protect itself from fragmentation. When something disrupts your psychological story, the ego rushes to restore continuity. An unanswered ending creates a rupture in the narrative, and ruptures feel destabilizing. But here's the shift. You no longer experience rupture the same way. When something ends without explanation, you may still feel sadness, but you do not feel identity collapse. You do not feel compelled to solve the puzzle immediately, because you understand something deeper now. Not every unanswered question contains hidden truth. Sometimes, it simply reflects limitation. The other person's limitation, the situation's limitation, the reality of human complexity. Earlier, you may have believed that closure would bring peace. But often, even when explanations were given, peace didn't come. Because closure is rarely about information. It's about control. If you could just understand why, you could regain control of the narrative, control of the story, control of how you saw yourself. But individuation reduces the need for narrative control. Jung believed that psychological growth requires confronting the unknown, not eliminating it. The unknown is uncomfortable. It exposes the limits of your power. It reminds you that you cannot manage every outcome. Earlier, you resisted that. Now you tolerate it. You may still think about the ending, but the thoughts don't loop endlessly. They arise and pass, because your identity no longer depends on solving them. There's also shadow integration happening here. Earlier, you may have projected meaning onto silence. If someone didn't respond, you interpreted it as rejection. If someone left abruptly, you interpreted it as personal failure. But projection fills gaps with fear. As you integrate shadow, you recognize your tendency to assume. You recognize the ego's desire to personalize, and you question it. Not every ending is about you. Not every silence is judgment. Not every absence is proof of inadequacy. That recognition weakens rumination. Jung warned that the unconscious seeks completion of patterns. But maturity involves recognizing that not every pattern will be completed externally. Some patterns must be closed internally. An internal closure is different. It does not require their explanation. It requires your acceptance. Acceptance means this: I may never know exactly why, and I can still move forward. That sentence once felt impossible. Now it feels tolerable. Earlier, you believed clarity would eliminate pain. Now, you understand something deeper. Pain does not disappear because of explanation. It softens because of integration. You integrate the experience. You reflect. You extract lessons. You release what cannot be known. You stop interrogating the silence. You stop demanding symmetry. Because symmetry is not guaranteed in life. Jung emphasized that the psyche moves toward wholeness by embracing paradox. Something can hurt and remain unanswered. Something can end and remain unclear. Something can matter and still dissolve without dialogue. You do not need perfect explanation to validate your experience. You know what you felt. You know what it meant to you. That is sufficient. Earlier, you may have feared that without closure, you would remain stuck. But now, you see that chasing closure often kept you stuck. The endless analyzing, the rehearsed conversations, the imagined outcomes, those loops prolong attachment. Acceptance shortens it. You are not indifferent to endings. You are less dependent on explanation. And that dependence was what made silence feel unbearable. Now, silence feels incomplete, but survivable, and survivable ambiguity is a sign of psychological consolidation. You can let something remain unfinished and still remain whole. At some point, something subtle happens. You realize you can walk away without the final conversation, without the perfectly worded ending, without the emotional postmortem, without extracting every hidden meaning, and the world does not collapse. Earlier, closure felt like justice, like emotional fairness. If something ended, you deserved clarity. If someone left, they owed you explanation. If silence appeared, it demanded resolution. But Carl Jung understood something difficult about the psyche. The ego seeks completion because it fears fragmentation. When a story ends abruptly, the ego feels split. When a question goes unanswered, the ego feels suspended. Suspension creates anxiety. So the ego demands symmetry. But individuation teaches something deeper. Wholeness does not require symmetry. Wholeness requires integration. You may never know exactly why they changed, why they left, why they withdrew, why they chose silence. And yet, you remain intact. That is the shift. Earlier, you believed answers would give you peace. Now, you understand that peace does not come from explanation. It comes from acceptance. Jung emphasized that psychological maturity requires tolerating the unknown. The unconscious is vast. Human motives are complex. Not everything can be articulated, even by the person who lived it. Sometimes people leave because they are confused, sometimes because they are avoidant, sometimes because they are not conscious enough to explain themselves, and sometimes because the connection simply reached its limit. You do not need a perfect narrative to validate your experience. You felt what you felt. You live what you lived. That is real, whether they explain it or not. Earlier, unanswered endings kept you attached. You replayed scenarios. You drafted unsent messages. You imagined what they would say if they finally spoke. That looping was an attempt to regain control. But control was never the same as closure. Control keeps you mentally entangled. Acceptance releases you. Acceptance says, "This ended in a way I don't fully understand, and I will not chase understanding at the cost of my peace." That sentence once felt impossible. Now it feels mature. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Unfinished endings once defined you. Now they inform you, but they do not imprison you. You extract meaning internally. You reflect. You learn. You integrate. And then you move forward, not because you received answers, but because you stop requiring them. There is also humility here. You accept that you may not be able to untangle every human interaction. You accept that some people lack the language for their own motives. You accept that some chapters end mid-sentence. And you stop trying to rewrite the ending. That release creates space. Space for new experiences. Space for emotional clarity. Space for growth. Closure is often ego-driven. Integration is self-driven. Closure demands explanation from the outside. Integration creates peace from the inside. You no longer need the other person to complete the story. You complete it by choosing your direction. And that is sovereignty. You are not suppressing emotion. You still feel loss. You still feel curiosity. You still feel the echo of what could have been. But the echo does not control you. It fades naturally because you are no longer feeding it with compulsive analysis. You are not indifferent to endings. You are resilient within them. And resilience does not require narrative perfection. It requires stability. You can let something remain unresolved and still remain resolved within yourself. There was a time when you believed closure was necessary, that without answers, you would remain stuck, that without explanation, you would remain incomplete, that without the final conversation, the story would haunt you. But something changed. Carl Jung understood that the ego craves resolution because it fears uncertainty. It wants a clean ending, a reason, a narrative it can file away neatly. But individuation requires something far more difficult. It requires tolerating what is unfinished. You may never know exactly why they left. You may never receive the explanation you once rehearsed in your mind. You may never hear the words that would have satisfied your curiosity. And yet, you are no longer destabilized by that, because you realize something deeper. Closure was never about information. It was about control. If you understood everything, you could stabilize the story. If you had answers, you could quiet the anxiety. If they explained themselves, you could restore order. But peace does not come from controlling the narrative. It comes from releasing the demand for it. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Unfinished endings once felt like unresolved identity. Now, they are simply experiences. They happened. They mattered. They ended. And you remain intact. You no longer chase explanation to confirm your worth. You no longer need symmetry to feel stable. You no longer demand a final word to move forward, because your movement is not dependent on their clarity. It is dependent on your integration. You can live with ambiguity. You can allow silence. You can let the chapter close mid-sentence and still continue writing your life. That is not emotional shutdown. That is ego consolidation. That is psychological maturity. The story does not owe you an explanation, and you no longer owe the story your piece. You are not unfinished, even if the ending was.